When I close my eyes, I still see the house on Willow Creek Road in Boston, Massachusetts. It stands in my memory like a frozen photograph, every detail as sharp as if I were walking up the driveway right now. The shutters were painted white, though they had chipped slightly with time, and the front door was a bold shade of red I had insisted on when we bought the house 16 years ago. Daniel had laughed at my stubbornness back then, reminding me that the house was already perfect, but I wanted that red door. It was my way of leaving a mark, of making the place undeniably ours. The garden was my pride. Every spring I planted tulips, lavender, and peonies, kneeling in the damp soil until my jeans were stained brown and my gloves torn. The neighbors always complimented me, saying the flowers made the house look alive. I loved hearing that because for me, this house had always been more than just walls and a roof. It was proof of a life built steadily, quietly, and carefully. My husband, Daniel Whitmore, worked as an accountant at a well-known firm in downtown Boston. He was never one for extravagance, and neither was I. We lived comfortably, not lavishly. Vacations meant a weekend trip to Cape Cod, or once in a while a flight to London, where we would walk along the Thames and sit in small cafes drinking tea we could have had at home. But I cherished those moments. They were enough. Daniel was steady, calm, and always reliable. He brought me flowers on Mondays, a ritual I never asked for but grew to expect. White lilies, yellow tulips, or sometimes a bouquet of roses, always. Fresh, always fragrant. He never raised his voice, never came home late without a reason, and never let me worry about money. He had a way of making everything seem safe. For 16 years, I believed our marriage was what people dreamed of, but rarely achieved. Two puzzle pieces that fit perfectly. No jagged edges, no broken corners. But life has a cruel way of shattering illusions in the most ordinary of moments. The day of Daniel's death began like any other. It was a Tuesday in early March, the kind of day when winter still clung to the air but spring teased from a distance. I remember making coffee, setting out his travel mug on the counter, and kissing him goodbye before he left for work. His gray suit looked freshly pressed, and his tie was the navy one with faint diagonal stripes I had given him last Christmas. There was nothing unusual, nothing that hinted at finality. Then, hours later, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was professional, polite, and devastating. Daniel had been in a car accident on the I-93. The impact was severe. He hadn't survived. I dropped the receiver and sank to the kitchen floor, unable to breathe, my body convulsing with sobs I couldn't control. It felt like the air itself had betrayed me, leaving me gasping and broken. That evening, Rebecca, my sister, came over. She held me as I cried until my voice cracked and my chest ached. "You'll get through this," she whispered, though I remember her eyes drifting around the room as if searching for something unspoken. The days that followed blurred into a haze of arrangements, condolences, and paperwork. The funeral cost $14,000, a detail I still recall with painful clarity because I paid it in cash from our joint savings account. It seemed wrong to attach numbers to grief, yet everything suddenly had a price. The insurance settlement arrived. Later, $220,000. When I held the check in my hands, it felt cold and detached, like hush money from the universe, as though I were being bribed to accept Daniel's absence. When the mourners left and the house returned to silence, that was when the weight of his absence pressed hardest on me. I walked through the rooms, touching the furniture, tracing my hand along the banister he used to polish on Sundays. Every corner whispered his presence, yet he was nowhere. I would sit in the living room at night staring at the untouched garage. Through the window. It had always been locked, always Daniel's space. He said it was messy, unfit for my organized eye. I never questioned him. But after the accident, the silence that lingered around that garage felt heavier than the casket I had watched lowered into the ground. One night, I decided to sort through his things. I pulled open drawers, folded his shirts, and packed his suits into bags for donation. The process felt mechanical, as if doing it would somehow push me forward into acceptance. Then, as I slid open the drawer of his nightstand, my hand brushed against something small and metallic. A key, not one I recognized. It was heavier than a house key and had no tag or marking to explain its purpose. I held it in my palm, staring at it for a long time, trying to remember if Daniel had ever mentioned another lockbox or storage unit. But nothing came to mind. The next day, I showed it to Rebecca when she stopped by. She looked at it briefly, her expression unreadable. Then, almost too quickly, she said, "Maybe don't go digging into things you can't handle." The words hung in the air like smoke. She smiled faintly after saying them, but her eyes flickered with something that unsettled me. That was the first moment I realized something was terribly wrong. My husband's death was tragic, yes, but it was not the whole story. At night, when the house was quiet and the shadows stretched long across the walls, I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, the key resting on the nightstand beside me. It seemed to glow in the dark, daring me to seek out the truth it promised. I thought about Daniel's routines, his flawless punctuality, his gentle gestures. Was it all real, or was it part of a carefully constructed performance? The memories of him began to shift in my mind. His late nights at the office suddenly seemed too frequent, his business trips too conveniently timed. I recalled a moment from years earlier when I had caught him tucking away papers into a briefcase as soon as I walked into the room. He had smiled, kissed me, and brushed it off as work stress. I had never pushed him for answers. Why would I? I trusted him completely. But now trust felt like a stranger's word. The house, once a sanctuary, became suffocating. The red door mocked me each time I walked through it, a bold statement of permanence when everything inside was unraveling. The flowers in the garden wilted under my neglect, and I didn't have the strength to care for them. Instead, I paced the hallways at night, listening to the hum of silence, wondering what secrets the walls had absorbed. I couldn't escape the feeling that Daniel had left behind a trail, and the key in my hand was only the beginning. My grief began to twist into something else, an uneasy curiosity, a gnawing need to know who Daniel truly was. The man I had loved for 16 years, the man who had kissed me goodbye on a Tuesday morning, might have been someone I barely knew at all. And so, while the rest of the world believed I was a grieving widow trying to piece her life back together, I knew my path was leading me somewhere darker. Somewhere filled with truths I wasn't sure I wanted to face. But it was too late to turn back. The silence in the house on Willow Creek Road was no longer just grief. It was a warning, and I was ready to listen. It took me weeks before I could gather the strength to walk toward the garage. Every time I passed the locked door, I felt Daniel's presence clinging to it, as if his secrets had soaked into the wood. For 16 years, he had brushed off my curiosity with a shrug and a gentle smile, always saying, "It's too messy in there, you wouldn't like it." I never pressed him. I thought his quirks were harmless. But after the funeral, the key I found in his nightstand kept whispering to me in the stillness of the night, I knew I had to confront what lay beyond that door. The first time I tried, I froze. I remember standing in the kitchen one late afternoon, the key cold and heavy in my palm, staring at the garage door as though it were an enemy. My heart pounded like I was preparing for battle, though all I had to do was insert the key and turn it. I walked away that day, ashamed of my fear. But grief does strange things. It chips away at hesitation until curiosity becomes stronger than terror. It was a gray Saturday morning when I finally gave in. I unlocked the door, the metal groaning with resistance, and stepped into the airless space. Dust floated like ghosts in the thin shafts of light that slipped through the narrow window. At first glance, it looked exactly as he had always described: messy, cluttered, ordinary. Boxes were stacked haphazardly along the walls, tools scattered on a workbench, an old lawnmower rusting in the corner. I almost laughed, almost convinced myself that my paranoia was foolish. But then I noticed the pattern of the boxes near the back wall, stacked too neatly, too deliberately, like a barricade. With trembling hands, I pushed them aside. Beneath layers of cardboard and dust was a thin wooden door I had never seen before. My breath caught. This was it. The reason he had kept me out. I pulled at the handle and the door creaked open to reveal a hidden room. The space was small, no larger than a walk-in closet, But what it held changed everything I thought I knew about my husband. On shelves lined against the wall were boxes of papers, binders filled with financial records, and envelopes fat with documents. Pinned to a corkboard were photographs, dozens of them. My eyes went first to one of a woman I had never seen before. Dark hair, sharp eyes, a warm smile. Her name, written in Daniel's handwriting on the back, was Claire. My stomach dropped as I flipped through more pictures, each one showing Claire and a boy. The boy had Daniel's eyes, Daniel's unmistakable smile, a child. His child. I collapsed onto an old stool, the air rushing from my lungs. My husband hadn't just been hiding receipts or a hobby. He had another life, another family. I picked up one of the envelopes and pulled out a stack of papers. Bank transfers, monthly payments, of $3,500 sent to an account in London. My husband had been moving money across the ocean for years, quietly, methodically, right under my nose. There were also letters addressed to Michael. I opened one with shaking hands. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Daniel wrote of missing birthdays, of promising to visit soon, of love and pride for a boy I had never known existed. I pressed the letter to my chest and felt my heart crack open. His death had already broken me, but this betrayal shattered me into pieces that I wasn't sure could ever be put back together. For hours I sat in that hidden room, reading letters, scanning documents, staring at photographs until their images burned into my memory. By the time I emerged, it was evening, and I was no longer the same woman who had walked in. My grief had transformed into something sharper, something filled with questions that demanded answers. The next morning, I made a decision that would alter the course of my life. I needed to find Claire. I needed to see the boy with my own eyes. I needed to know the truth from the only other person who could give it to me. So I drove to New York the following weekend. I remember gripping the steering wheel, the city skyline rising in the distance as my chest tightened with every mile. I had tracked down her address from one of the records I found in the garage, a townhouse in Brooklyn. The building was modest, brick with white-trimmed windows and a small stoop where potted plants clung stubbornly to life. My hands shook as I climbed the steps and knocked on the door. When she opened it, she didn't look surprised. She looked resigned. Claire stood before me, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and defiance. For a moment, we simply stared at each other. Two women bound by the same man, though in entirely different ways. "You must be her," she said softly, not as a question but as a statement. "And you're Claire." My voice wavered, but I forced the words out. She stepped aside, motioning me in. The townhouse was warm but cluttered, the kind of space lived in by someone who carried too many responsibilities. Then I saw him, Michael, a boy of 13, sitting on the couch with a book in his lap. When he looked up, my heart stuttered. His eyes, those same gray-blue eyes I had kissed goodnight for years, stared back at me. He was Daniel's son, through and through. Claire followed my gaze and sighed. "He promised me he'd tell you," she said, her voice edged with bitterness. "He promised he'd stop lying, that he'd find a way to bring us all together. But he couldn't do it. He told me he couldn't leave you until the mortgage was paid off. And then he died, and now we're both left holding the pieces." Her words pierced me like knives. Anger and grief tangled in my chest. I wanted to scream at her, to demand why she had accepted scraps of Daniel's time and affection, but when I looked at Michael again, I couldn't. He was innocent. He hadn't asked to be born into this deception. He was just a boy, caught in the storm of Daniel's choices. I sat with Claire for nearly 2 hours. She told me things I didn't want to hear, stories of Daniel's weekends in New York, of birthdays celebrated in secret, of promises made and broken. She showed me receipts, letters, and photographs, proof stacked upon proof until denial was no longer possible. I left her townhouse hollow, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me so heavily I thought I might collapse on the sidewalk. The drive back to Boston was a blur. I replayed every conversation I had ever had with Daniel, searching for signs I had missed. Every business trip, every late night, every unexplained absence suddenly fit into a pattern I had been too blind to see. By the time I pulled into the driveway of my red door house, I was trembling with rage. Rebecca was waiting for me inside. She had brought a bottle of wine, her excuse for checking on me. We sat at the kitchen table, the bottle between us, and I began to tell her about the townhouse in Brooklyn, about Claire, about Michael, about the money. I watched her carefully as I spoke. She froze. Just for a moment, but it was enough. Her eyes widened, her lips parted, and then she masked it with a sip of wine. She tried to act surprised, but her silence betrayed her. My own sister had known. Maybe not everything, maybe not every detail, but enough. Enough to keep me in the dark. Enough to protect Daniel's secrets while I lived in ignorance. I set my glass down and looked at her with a new kind of clarity. For the first time, I realized the betrayal didn't stop with Daniel. It had seeped into my own family, weaving a web of silence and complicity around me. And in that moment, I knew my grief was no longer just about losing a husband. It was about losing the life I thought I had, the trust I thought was unshakable. The house on Willow Creek Road felt colder than ever and the silence heavier. But now I also knew something else. The story wasn't finished. The key had opened more than a door. It had opened the truth. And I wasn't ready to stop searching. It was weeks after I visited Claire's townhouse in Brooklyn that I stumbled upon the next clue, though stumble is not quite the right word. It felt less like a coincidence and more like Daniel had laid a trail, breadcrumbs left for me to follow after his death. Only, unlike fairy tales, the trail didn't lead to safety. It led me further into the shadows I didn't want to see. I had been avoiding the bank in Providence, Rhode Island for weeks. Among the papers I'd found in the hidden garage room, one stood out. A slip of paper with the name of a safe deposit box scrawled in Daniel's handwriting. At first, I ignored it. I told myself I didn't need to know more, that I'd already unearthed enough betrayal to last a lifetime. But the key from his nightstand, still resting on my dresser, seemed to hum in the silence of the house. It called to me each night, whispering that I hadn't yet reached the end of what he had left behind. On a rainy Thursday morning, I finally drove to Providence. The bank was cold, sterile, its marble floors echoing under my heels as I walked to the front desk. I handed over the slip and signed my name with a shaking hand. The clerk disappeared for a moment, then returned with a small box, long and narrow, aged but well kept. My breath caught as I opened it. Inside was not what I expected. No stacks of cash, no incriminating paperwork, at least not at first glance. Instead, there was a necklace. A heavy silver chain with a locket, polished smooth as though it had been handled often. My fingers trembled as I lifted it from the velvet lining. The weight of it felt disproportionate to its size, as though it carried more than just metal. I clicked it open, expecting a photograph of Claire or Michael, something that would pierce me with another wound. But inside was not a picture at all. It was a tiny key, no larger than the nail on my pinky finger, intricately designed with a strange insignia etched onto the head. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew instinctively that this was no ordinary keepsake. Daniel hadn't hidden it in a deposit box by accident. That night, I called Claire. She answered after the third ring, her voice tired. I told her about the necklace, about the miniature key, and waited for her to brush it off. Instead, there was silence. Then she whispered, "He told me once. If anything happened to him, the answers would be in Switzerland." Her words rattled around in my mind for days. Eventually, she connected me with a man she knew, someone Daniel had trusted, with certain transactions. Through him, I discovered that the insignia belonged to a vault in Zurich. Daniel had hidden accounts there, millions apparently. Offshore money, the kind of money that doesn't just sit quietly, the kind of money that draws attention from dangerous people. I felt the floor beneath me tilt when I heard the figure. Nearly $2.7 million. My husband, the steady accountant who bought me flowers on Mondays and pressed his suits carefully, had hidden away a fortune across the Atlantic. My hands shook as I clutched the phone, trying to process how far this double life stretched. But knowledge has consequences. And once I learned of the accounts, things began to change around me. The first sign came 3 days later. A black sedan parked across the street from my house. I noticed it as I carried groceries in from the car, its tinted windows reflecting the overcast sky. It didn't move for hours. That night, as I stood at the window staring out, the engine roared to life and the car slipped away into the darkness. The second sign was more direct. A letter slipped under my front door, its words typed in cold, mechanical font. Hand over everything Daniel left behind. This is your only warning. I sat at the kitchen table, clutching the letter as fear rose, like a tide in my chest. My pulse thundered in my ears. This was no longer about betrayal or grief. This was about danger, about men who wanted what Daniel had hidden. I didn't know where to turn. Rebecca came over the next evening, and though I hadn't intended to, I showed her the letter. Her face drained of color. She grabbed my hands and whispered, "You have to stop digging. You don't understand who he was involved with." Her words cut through me like glass. "You knew," I accused. "You knew all along." Tears welled in her eyes, but guilt twisted her expression. Finally, she confessed. Daniel had once asked for her help laundering money. He had funneled stacks of cash, $50,000 at a time, through her small real estate firm in Boston. At first, she didn't question it, thinking it was shady but not dangerous. But as the amounts grew and the transfers became more complicated, she realized the truth. She had been complicit in washing his money clean. "I begged him to stop," she whispered, gripping my hands tighter. "But he wouldn't. And now, if you don't let this go, they'll come after you too." Her words should have frightened me into silence, but instead, they ignited something inside me. I had already lost everything. The husband I thought I knew, the life I thought was safe, the illusion of trust in my own family. What more could they take? If men in black cars thought they could intimidate me into handing over what was mine, to discover they were mistaken. I called Laura, my childhood friend, the one person I trusted without hesitation. She came over that night, and together we spread the documents across my dining room table. Claire joined us a few days later, bringing Michael with her. He sat quietly, watching us with a mix of curiosity and fear, his young eyes absorbing more than any boy his age should. We pieced through the files, wills that left different assets to different women, carefully constructed to avoid suspicion. Letters written to Claire that spoke of love more freely than he had ever shown me. Notes to me, outlining practicalities and stability, never passion. My heart cracked open again as I realized he had compartmentalized his affection, giving us each different pieces of himself. Then there were the darker documents. Records of offshore companies registered in Europe, names of partners tied to construction deals that smelled of corruption, threatening letters demanding money owed. It was a web of deceit, and Daniel had been tangled in the center. I sat at that table, reading words that shifted my entire world. Betrayal deepened with each page, but so too did my resolve. For years, I had lived in silence, trusting in the illusion of stability Daniel created. But now I saw silence differently. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the weight of secrets pressing down, suffocating. And I was done being suffocated. That night, after Claire and Michael left, Laura placed her hand over mine. "You can let this destroy you," she said softly, "or you can turn it into power. You have the leverage now. Don't forget that." I looked at the necklace on the table, the miniature key glinting under the kitchen light. It had led me here, to the truth I both dreaded and needed. And though I was scarred by what I had uncovered, I felt something new stirring in my chest. Not grief, not despair, but something harder, sharper. Resolve. I would not let Daniel's lies define me. I would not let the men in black cars silence me. I would not crumble under the weight of betrayal. The necklace, the documents, the accounts, they were no longer just remnants of his double life. They were mine now, and I would learn how to wield them. By the time spring settled over Boston, I was no longer the same woman who had buried her husband only months before. The grief was still there, yes, but it had taken on a new shape. It wasn't the hollow ache that had once kept me from breathing. Now it burned, fueling me, sharpening me. Every document spread across my kitchen table, every photograph of Claire, And Michael, every financial record of Daniel's deceit, had carved away at the woman who once lived in ignorance. What remained was someone harder, someone unwilling to be broken again. But with this transformation came the reality I could no longer ignore. The men in black cars weren't going to vanish simply because I wished it. The threatening letter under my door was not a warning I could take lightly. They wanted what Daniel had left behind, and they weren't going to stop until they got it, or until I showed them that I was not afraid. I spent nights awake, staring at the ceiling of my bedroom in the house on Willow Creek Road, listening to every creak of the wood, every rustle outside. Fear kept me from sleep, but determination kept me from collapsing under it. Eventually, I realized that waiting for them to make the next move would only destroy me. If I wanted control, I had to take it. That was when I decided to confront them. Myself. Through contacts Claire had reluctantly provided, men Daniel had once worked with in shadowy corners of finance, I arranged a meeting. It was risky, foolish even, but I was tired of being a hunted widow in my own home. The meeting would take place in a Manhattan hotel in a conference room booked under a false name. I spent 3 days preparing, gathering everything I had: the necklace, the miniature key, the files from the hidden garage, the bank records from Zurich, even the letters Daniel had written to both me and Claire. They were my arsenal. On the morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully. A navy suit I had bought years ago for an anniversary dinner, polished black heels, and my hair pulled back into a simple knot. I wanted to look strong, unshaken, even if my stomach churned with dread. Laura drove me to the hotel, her hand steady on the wheel as I clutched the folder of documents in my lap. Before I stepped out, she gripped my arm. "Don't let them see fear," she whispered. "They only respect power." Her words echoed in my mind as I walked into that sterile conference room. The men were already there, 3 of them, dressed in tailored suits, their faces expressionless but their eyes sharp. They watched me as though calculating my worth, as though deciding whether I was a threat or a pawn. I didn't sit at first. I placed the necklace on the table, its silver chain glinting under the fluorescent lights. Then I set the folder down beside it, sliding it toward them. "You can threaten me," I said, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. "But you cannot erase what I have. Every document here is copied and hidden. If anything happens to me or to Claire or to Michael, those copies will be in the hands of federal agents within the hour." The silence that followed was suffocating. One of the men leaned back, studying me with a faint smile that chilled me. "You think you can bargain with us?" he asked. "I don't need to bargain," I replied. "I need to survive, and I'm giving you a choice. Leave me and my family alone or risk everything being exposed." It was a bluff, but a convincing one. The truth was, I hadn't yet handed the copies to anyone outside Laura and Claire, but they didn't need to know that. They only needed to believe that I was no longer powerless. After a long pause, the man at the center nodded slowly. "You're smarter than I expected." He gathered the papers, glanced at them briefly, then slid them back across the table. "We'll let this be for now, but remember, power is only safe when it's hidden." I left the hotel with my legs trembling, but I kept my head high until I reached Laura's car. Only when the doors closed did I let out the breath I had been holding. The bluff had worked, at least for now. That night, I sat alone in the living room of the house on Willow Creek Road, staring at the red door from inside. For the first time, I realized I could no longer live there. The walls were soaked in Daniel's lies, the rooms filled with memories that no longer belonged to me. The house had once been my sanctuary, but now it was a prison of ghosts. Within weeks, I put it on the market. It sold faster than I expected, for $780,000. When I signed the final papers, I felt a strange mix of grief and liberation. I packed my belongings, less than I thought I'd keep, and moved to a smaller place near the coast of Maine. The ocean became my companion, its endless waves reminding me that life, no matter how shattered, always moves forward. With the portion of Daniel's accounts I was able to claim, I made deliberate choices. First, I secured legal protection for Michael and Claire, ensuring they would not be left vulnerable to the men who still lurked in the shadows. Second, I invested $150,000 into Laura's small business, giving her not just my trust but also my future. Together, we began building something new, something honest. But healing wasn't immediate. Even in Maine, even with the sound of the waves and the smell of salt air, grief visited me like an old friend. There were nights when I lay awake, replaying every kiss, every smile Daniel had ever given me, wondering how much of it had been real. Betrayal doesn't leave clean wounds, it leaves scars that ache in quiet moments. Still, I learned to live with it, to live with the contradictions of love and deceit, of grief and resolve. I learned that silence could bury you, suffocating you under the weight of what you refuse to confront. But silence could also be transformed into resilience, into power. I chose transformation. When I think of Daniel now, I no longer see just the husband who brought me lilies on Mondays. I see the man who built walls of lies, who divided his love between two women, who dragged us into a world of shadows. But I also see the man who, in his recklessness, gave me the strength to become someone new. I am no longer just the widow of Daniel Whitmore. I am the woman who confronted his ghosts, who stood before dangerous men and refused to break, who walked away from a house filled with lies and built a new life on the strength of my own hands. My story did not end with his death. It began there. And though I am scarred, though betrayal carved deep lines into my heart, I emerged not weaker but stronger. I chose to walk forward, not as the deceived wife left behind, but as someone who carries resilience like armor, who holds power not in secrets but in truth. And that is how I survived.